From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Remember the catastrophic volcano eruption in Tonga, the small Pacific island country, this January? Since that ominous start, extreme weather disasters have been creating havoc worldwide in 2022. The latest include epic floods in Pakistan, killing nearly 1,000 people and triggering a national emergency. In Mississippi, the United States residents are fleeing their homes after massive flooding warnings. And here in China, things are not that much better. More than 20,000 people battled heroically to put out forest fires. Are we going to face a weather apocalypse sooner than scientists predicted? And can we survive? Let's take a look at the new global weatherscape.
As Europe suffers a drought, the hunger stones have re-emerged in the receding Rhine River. And on the other side of the world, as the water level of the Yangtze River dropped, a submerged islet in southwestern China popped up, revealing 3 Buddhist statues believed to be more than 6 centuries old. While archaeologists will be happy with the discovery, it's a nightmare for hydrologists, who fear there will be less water for the planet's needs. It's been a year of wild weather: unprecedented heat wave in Portugal and Spain, floods in Pakistan, droughts in Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa, deforestation and glacier melt across Latin America and the Caribbean. All this will have far-reaching impact on ecosystems, food and water security, human health, and poverty.
Now, for more reactions on the repercussions and possible mitigation measures of extreme weather events and climate change, I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel of experts. Ms. Wu Changhua is Vice Chair at the Governing Council of Asia-Pacific Water Forum. She joins us from Washington, D.C. In Beijing, we have Professor Guan Dabo from Tsinghua University. In Bangkok, Thailand, we have Winston Chow, Senior Environment Expert. And in Dundee, Scotland, the UK, we have Philip Andrews Speed, Senior Principal Fellow of Energy Studies Institute at National University of Singapore. Everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining us at this hour. Mr. Chow, let me start with you, and let's look at the floods in Pakistan that is not so far from China, China's southern borders. It's unprecedented in 30 years, to borrow the word of Pakistan's Prime Minister. And across the world, from the Horn of Africa, for example, it's experiencing droughts unprecedented in 40 years. What triggered these kinds of escalations this year?
So scientific evidence clearly points to anthropomorphic, that's man-made climate change as the culprit for these escalations. Now, while I think climate deniers might highlight the Earth's natural changes in climate over time series data spanning tens and hundreds of thousands of years, I wouldn't much buy that. Simply put, the statistical chance of these climate-related disasters being linked to natural fluctuations in climate is astronomically small. The science overwhelmingly supports that the disasters we're seeing today, the floods and heat waves, are related directly to impacts from industrial emissions.
All right, Madam Wu, in Washington, D.C., let me turn to you. If we look at floods occurring globally these days, what is their impact on water security, on our safe drinking water that concerns basically everyone? Water shortages also directly affect the farming industry and food security. You have been researching about that. How can this be addressed?
It's probably one of the biggest questions on the table today, and the global community is struggling with the water security. In some places, it's just too much, and in many others, it's too little. Of course, besides that, we also have this too dirty challenges there as well. Extreme weather events, and particularly droughts, heat waves, droughts, as well as flooding, represents the major disruption of human-induced climate change on the water cycle of the planet. And water is life. There seems to be no short-term, immediate way out at this moment. So if you look around the world, country, governments, business, community, even back down to household, everyone is jumping into trying to manage the water security. So you started to see in China, for instance, for crop, production, we started to look for more diversion of water. We're still trying to find new sources of water besides that, saving water. And in Spain, for instance, you started to see desalination is becoming a major sort of source at this moment as well. So short term, we're desperate to look for new sources of water, and while managing the water, saving water at the same time.
Yeah, water is life. It's an essential part of the ecosystem of biodiversity. Professor Guan, let me turn to you. The city of Chongqing, for example, in southwestern China, reported wildfires in early August, which is this month. Then more wildfires broke out, unfortunately, continuing for almost 3 weeks. Wildfires also have been devastating regions in the United States, Australia, Greece, among other regions. How do you look at this phenomena?
Well, there's certainly people in maybe in a few years back, they said this is just a single event. It's just a fire or wildfire single event. Now I think more and more people will understand this is triggered by the extreme weather event. We have seen continuous wildfire in the U.S. West Coast, and then this year very rarely happened in the southwest of China, like in Chongqing. We have heard about large scale of the wildfires. It creates kind of lots of disasters. It's not only the air pollution in the local because of the burning the wood, but also after the wildfires, we possibly will have like the California have done, they have a landsliding disaster, many other type of disasters. This type of extreme weather events, they would cause hugely socioeconomic losses. Apart from the social losses threatened to the people's life, we will have lots of the economic losses as well. According to many previous research have done, the flooding itself, for example, wildfire, I think in China that has been studied not very throughout, but the flooding in terms of the future kind of the possible disasters along this is like the extreme kind of temperature rising scenarios. Chinese, we're gonna see the physical and also the cascading economic losses along the supply chain will be about 5 to 10% of the Chinese GDP in the future. So this is a basic loss. We are going to see this is very, very big things.
Professor Guan, talking about the economic losses, for example, due to the Yangtze River drying up, hydropower generation has been controlled and curtailed in southwestern China, right?
Yeah.
We've seen malls in Chongqing, for example, having curtailed their opening hours, while factories in southern China are curbing output. How do you assess this management and its impact on the Chinese economy?
Economists hasn't very well established a methodology to measure the compound effects. I think there's research is going on this side. People will just say, okay, it's a wildfire, and drought, and heat stress as a single event. But linking with the shortage of electricity supplies and the further knock-on effect of sequencing effects of the other extreme weathers, the socioeconomic costs will be tripled or maybe multiple increase. And it doesn't increase in the linear way. There will be very much kind of growing really quickly and then going non-linearly. And then don't forget, there's also the supply chain issues. If one of the places, like a large city like Chongqing or other places that got damaged, all other cities or other regions in China, as well as the rest of the world, will got issues because of the linkage between the supply chain networks. So as you mentioned before, this the adaptation, or like say the helping each other, we can see in Chongqing, not only the Chongqing cities, many other cities will help Chongqing to get rid of the wildfire. It's not only protect them Chongqing itself, but also provide the supply chain, which is go very much to many other places.
Yeah, certainly
in China.
There are ripple effects, cascading effects,
exactly.
and compound effects, as you have mentioned. Let's talk about climate change in general. Mr. Andrew Speed in Scotland. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made it very clear. It put out an analysis that says if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, coal use must be slashed by 70% by 2030. And that's not enough. By 2050, we'll have to stop using coal altogether. How feasible is it?
Well, I think it was difficult anyway, but with the droughts that we've seen across much of the Northern Hemisphere, people are turning back to coal, not least in China and in Europe. So I think the challenge of removing coal from the energy mix has just suddenly got a little more difficult. However, at the same time, I think in order just to have energy, there's more investment going on into renewable energies such as solar and wind. But I think what this drought has told us is that the assumption that hydroelectricity is reliable, that assumption is wrong. And we've seen it in China, we've seen it in Norway, and possibly in the past in Brazil, that we have to assume that hydroelectricity is not as reliable as it used to be. So the challenge in the short term of getting rid of coal has become more difficult, but maybe this will spur us on to accelerate the deployment of non-hydro renewable energy.
It is a multifaceted issue. Mr. Chow, where do you see extreme weather events taking us in the bid to switch to clean energy? Will recurring droughts, for example, affect hydropower? Is there any foolproof option or anything close to that?
Right. So I think the foolproof option is nuclear power, and the Chinese government knows this. China plans to build as many as 30 new nuclear power plants by 2030. In fact, the U.S. government knows this too. Former Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz is very publicly expressing the importance of nuclear in reducing emissions that impact climate change. The key to nuclear is good safety protocols, such as those that we see in places like France. New nuclear technologies, or so-called Generation 4 technology, reactor technologies, also offer safety features that ably prevent catastrophic failures, such as the ones we've seen with old nuclear power plants in the past. Another challenge to nuclear is basically educational. I think a lot of regular people don't trust nuclear so much because they think of the environmental damage caused by meltdowns at places like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima. Those were, of course, terrible cases, but also extremely isolated cases.
Right. Madame Wu, we have seen the U.S. taking a major domestic climate action in August. President Joe Biden signed this Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, has been described as the largest investment in climate action in U.S. history. It will spend nearly $370 billion in the next 10 years. How do you look at its possible impact? How will it actually address inflation?
Well, on the climate change side, I think it's fascinating to see the progress and on the U.S. legislative part, because we all know for decades, the U.S. has never succeeded in moving forward with the climate legislation. Finally, here it is. And if you look at the specific contents there, tax incentives is pretty much all over the places. So the national government, the federal government now has an industrial policy to really incentivize the scaling of the market, particularly around the electric vehicles, solar, wind, among others. Besides, of course, energy efficiency is also a big part of it there. But in the meantime, I think a part of the debate is around the inflation. Even though the legislation title is called Inflation Reduction Act, but the short-term, medium-term, the impact on inflation will be really minimal. And if there is any immediate outcome there at all, maybe in the longer term that will be. The challenge in reality here, I think, in terms of there's law here, we need to deploy them. So it's also about the supply chain, right? And so for the U.S., if you look at the current high inflation, challenges here. The labor market is tight, wages are high, supply chain is not there. And so literally the US has to start from scratch in order to restructure the supply chain. To large extent, that's going to be further exacerbate inflation if not addressed in a very effective manner. So on the positively on the climate change side, it's fascinating to see the progresses. In the meantime, I don't think it will be adding too much or contributing too much in terms of solution of inflation at this moment.
Right. Professor Guan, talking about China-U.S. climate cooperation has been put on hold after U.S. provocations in the Taiwan Strait. How important, or to what extent do you think U.S.-China cooperation on climate change is essential for addressing the issues of climate change for our sustainable future?
I think it's crucially important. As I had a conversation with our American colleagues in Harvard and in Yale, we all believe we will continue collaborate from the at least from scientists and from the collaboration perspective, scientific or academic collaborations, trying to further push and then to keep the collaboration ongoing is very important because the two countries are the largest emitters in the world, and they are leading. Both China and the U.S. are leading the global climate change mitigations work in the future. Talking about today's topic, we have a huge amount of extreme weather events. We will have a huge amount of the risk in terms of events, and the climate change work would require these two countries work together to lead on the global leadership, and not only on the mitigations but also on adaptation as well. So I don't think the normal collaboration among the scientists, academic field, or even the public would stop. But I hope that the two countries would very soon resolve the disagreement in terms of the other issues, and then the global climate change issues. It's a whole humankind issues. We could work together. We would require the two major countries to lead the global to achieve these things.
Exactly. Professor Andrew Speed, do you see the sanctions on Russian oil and gas speeding up the global green energy transition, or is it working the other way around, or could they actually set a huge setback for the global green transition?
Well, I think in the short term, certainly looking at the European end, we've got countries like Germany turning back on their coal-fired power stations that they were about to close. So in the short term, this is bad news. In the longer term, I think hopefully it will accelerate the development of more natural gas from other sources, but obviously that is another fossil fuel. So yeah, it just pushes us down the line of more renewable energy. And as Winston Chow said, push ahead with nuclear. But there are a number of uncertainties with the new nuclear technologies, Generation 4. They have not yet been proven at scale. So we await that development. So I think there will be a short-term surge of coal, and we're seeing that this year. But hopefully then we move on and push on with renewable energy, storage, carbon capture, and maybe nuclear.
Yeah, Mr. Chow, according to a World Bank report, 19 countries are facing the highest number of threats, including water and food shortages and greater exposure to natural disasters. They're also among the world's 40 least peaceful countries. How can we stop this downward spiral?
Yeah, I think there's an intrinsic link between climate and peace. Historically, peace and threats to peace have been intrinsically linked to resources. Wars occur mostly out of a need or want for resources. That's what we see in the countries that you're mentioning. Climate change threatens practically every valuable resource we need for life. It impacts fresh water availability, it impacts livable temperature, agriculture, food supply, real estate, infectious disease, all at the same time dramatically. These are the things that threaten the stability of governments. And I think understanding the cross-sectoral nature of climate impacts and these compounding effects makes coming to the conclusion that climate and peace are inseparable pretty simple.
Madame Wu, what do you think, the correlation between climate change and peace?
Well, it's obvious. I think it's a case made already, proven historically, and also we are living in it. There's also migration, forced migration, right? And if you look at Latin America, the U.S. has been experiencing this sort of migration from Latin America regions. If you look at the Middle East and others, it's definitely one of the major challenges their global community needs to address. A couple of other points to make. I think throughout this extreme weather events, the disasters, humanity for the first time really recognizes or seizes actually the nexus of water, food, energy, climate change, ecosystems. Then of course it's also linked to peace, stability, and social issues there as well, public health issues there as well. And so on the negative side, it's unfortunate. We had to live in it. We see losses of, lives and damages to our economy, the risks, the threats, and, we're literally living in the disasters. On the positive side, I think this is also sort of extreme weather events or climate change drills. We are trained literally to go through this extreme weather events so that we'll be able to learn from it and really understand the nature, the essence of the issues there, so that policymakers, business community, and the society overall, between countries, among countries, actually, we do need to work together. As climate change is intensifying, we see more intensity, frequency, longer lasting extreme weather events. And so we had to bear the cost, and more than ever, we need the global community to work with each other. Early on, you talked about US-China. The two countries really have to seriously rethinking, reshape, restructure, bilateral relationship, because it's their responsibility and obligations are to do so. So it's not only for their own sake, but really for the sake of global community.
Yeah, when it comes to climate change, enough geopolitics is enough. Now, Professor Guan, China has promised to peak its carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and to reduce carbon intensity by over 65% in 2030. From its 2005 levels. However, many analysts are now saying that these goals can be significantly overachieved. How do you look at that assessment?
I personally don't think it's overachieved. I think there has to be a sequencing, and then some of the places, some regions, some sectors will deliver the carbon peak or neutrality at the first places, and the other places will join it in a later stage. I think globally is like the similar thing. Some of the developed countries in the US and the EU will has already achieved emission peak. They will hopefully deliver the neutrality before 2050, as most of the countries promised. Some of the European countries, for example, Denmark, kind of aiming to deliver the carbon neutrality in 2025. It seems it recently has some changes from the Danish administrations. So some advanced countries need to go further, and they're trying to make some rooms for future development by the developing countries. And similar in China as well. As a whole, we were aiming to achieve the carbon emission peak by 2030. Some places will be advanced, some places will be after the timeline. But overall, I think this is not overachieved.
Professor Andrew Speed, how do you look at China's dual carbon goals coming along?
Well, I think, as Professor Guan has said, the target of peaking carbon by 2030, I think is realistic. There's been a bit of a blip with the surge of coal use in the last year or two, but hopefully that can be flattened out and the use of coal can decline, because that's key. The 2060 carbon neutrality, which an official confirmed referred to all greenhouse gases, I think that is quite a different challenge. And I think because that includes agriculture and forestry and all sorts of other things as well. And that, for China as well as for other countries, will be a big challenge. The key, of course, is the rate of economic growth. The slower the rate of economic growth in China, the easier that will be, as we found in Europe. The economy slows down to 1 or 2%, and suddenly you're rate of increase of energy use declines, and you can really switch coal out of the mix. If the rate of growth in China goes back to 6% and then stays there for a long time, moving to carbon neutrality will prove more difficult.
The United Nations Climate Summit, or COP27, will be held in Egypt in November. Do you all think it will take any concrete actions, or will it be bogged down by the Ukraine crisis and U.S.-China tensions? Let me start with you, Madame Wu.
I remain hopeful. I know it's challenging, but this year in particular, because of the extreme weather events all around the globe, I think losses and damages or climate justice will become probably overwhelmingly the agenda of COP27. And of course, mitigation will continue to be discussed and negotiated. But with the war situation, I think, unfortunately, fossil fuels coming back and short-term we won't be able to address that. And the other very important element in the climate justice is for developed countries to deliver, honor their commitment, particularly around the financial commitment. They still have not delivered this $100 billion every year. By 2020, we're already in 2022, and there's more money to be expected on the table. So we'll see, fingers crossed.
Winston, Chow?
Yeah, I agree with Madame Wu that success at COP27 is so vital. But frankly, based on the last few, I'm skeptical of outcomes from UN Conference of Parties in general. And I don't think COP27 would even require the Ukraine crisis to be bogged down from taking concrete action. But I also think effective climate action usually starts locally at the city government level. So there's still hope, even if COP27 proves to be insufficient. An exception to that rule that I've seen is China, where climate action is in fact led by the central government, and that's quite unique.
Yeah, Professor Guan?
I personally would like to see three things happening in the COP27. First, as Vincent was just mentioned, hopefully we're going to see not only the government leading kind of the collaboration, and we possibly need some mechanisms from the city perspective. I think the second thing I would like to see is that our global agreement on the we are our global community. We are all the victims for extreme climate risks. And there's no any places in the world are not sensitive to climate change. All places are sensitive to climate risks, and it will be require global effort to address that. And the third, and not the least, we hope the global leaderships countries would be able to make more effort in terms of joining to help technologically, financially, and politically to make joint agreements for the climate change adaptation and the mitigations.
All right, Mr. Andrew Speed.
Well, I think I'll just pick up on Madame Wu's point about the financing. And I've just recently moved back from Singapore to the UK. And here, yeah, I mean, the economy is the challenge. Inflation is rising day by day. Heating costs this coming winter will be 4 or 5 times what they were last winter. So, the government's going to hand out money. There's inflation. There are problems everywhere, not just in Britain, in Europe. And so, there isn't much money around. And I think the politicians' willingness to share it with the developing world may be rather less than 2 years ago. So I would be pessimistic about this, whether, again, that $100 billion can be found, will be found, and will be shared, which I think is one of the critical things that COP should be achieving.
Thank you also very much, everyone, for this fascinating discussion. And thank you for watching The Hub on CGTN. That will do it for this edition. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.